This year's games took place in Crater Lake and were surrounded by a forest as well as mountains. This year's arena had once been a national park in the state of Oregon in Old America and had been widely visited by tourists. The tributes noticed that it was slightly clouded above the lake, but the arena was generally rather cool in temperature. The cornucopia was placed on a small island in the middle of a large cratered lake, which had been formed thousands of years ago by the fall of a volcano, with narrow strips of land stretching out towards the tribute podiums, forming 8 spokes, with 3 tributes in each spoke. Although the original lake had an area of more than 50 kilometers, the game makers had modified the lake so that it had a radius of only 300 meters. After swimming to the end of the lake, one would find either a forest or mountains, depending on which direction they swam in. The forest was rather temperate, and it stretched for about a kilometer, left to right. The forest soon became elevated, and they eventually grew into mountains. The mountains had several clearings for tributes to hide, and several of the clearings consisted of pine trees. Back in the cornucopia, the countdown was passing 40 seconds. Icarus from 2 was placed on a podium in the third wedge, between Stretcher from 12 and Peppa from 11. He turned around to see the 5th wedge, where Aurelia from 2 was standing between Emerald from 1 and Tab from 3. Icarus rolled his shoulders back and took in his surroundings, before noticing Stretcher staring at him in fear. Icarus cocked his head and smirked at Stretcher, which caused him to change his gaze. In the 8th wedge, Syndicate from 12 was desperately looking around for his district partner, Stretcher. She noticed Cormac from 11 shaking his head at her, although she raised her eyebrows back at him and cocked her head towards the cornucopia. The gong sounded and all the tributes dove inwards, presumably due to them not understanding the potential danger of doing so. Icarus dove into the water and began swimming towards the strip of land, and was the first tribute to make it onto the land. He sprinted as fast as he could towards the cornucopia, before noticing Fonio from 9 dashing towards the cornucopia as well. Both boys reached the cornucopia at the same time, and Fonio punched Icarus as hard as he could, which caused him to stumble back, and this gave Fonio enough time to run into the cornucopia. Aurelia decided that it would be safer to swim the entire way to the cornucopia, and she immediately dove into the water, before swimming gracefully and quickly towards the island. She grunted as she pulled herself out of the water, and noticed Emerald grabbing a set of throwing knives. Aurelia got to her feet, and she ran towards a bow and arrow just as Emerald threw one of her knives at Samsonite from 5, who was struggling to stay afloat after he fell off his podium. Aurelia gave Emerald a grin as the knife hit Samsonite in the chest, and he sank underwater and did not resurface. Stretcher was transfixed to the spot for a few moments, before swearing as he realized where he was and making a daring leap towards the stretch of land. He scraped his right hand on it, and he groaned as his blood fell into the water. Yet he managed to pull himself up and run. He noticed Samsonite sinking underwater, and he rolled his eyes at Emerald's cheers of victory. Just then, the girl from 3 was thrown backwards into the water as a crate, which had just been thrown by Spectacles from 1, who was standing next to Aurelia, hit her in the chest. Aurelia wasted no time in shooting an arrow at the neck of the girl, who was now struggling to breathe. Stretcher groaned, yet he continued running and did not look back. Meanwhile, Syndicate had trouble making up her mind about whether to go to the cornucopia or not, yet as soon as she saw Cormac jump into the water, she decided to do so as well. She jumped into the water, and although she appeared to have trouble swimming, she did not seem to care and continued swimming and failed to notice Tab from 3 swimming after her. She reached the island in about 40 seconds, and she ran towards the mouth of the cornucopia to see Icarus stabbing Alejandra from 10 to death. Icarus was in a state of anger after watching Fonio enter the cornucopia, yet as he got to his feet, Spectacle rushed past him, waving his machete in a way Rubius described as crazy and mad. Icarus watched the Spectacle cut off the legs of Caliente from 7 with his machete, before slamming the blade down onto her head. Icarus scowled, before stumbling into the cornucopia and grabbing a serrated sword. He noticed Alejandra trying to find Tobe from 10, and he subsequently gripped his sword tightly and stabbed it down into Alejandra's neck. Alejandra struggled to breathe, and Icarus continued stabbing her, before noticing a set of throwing knives that had been dropped by Tobe seconds before. He grabbed one of the knives and threw it at a running Tobe, which hit him in the back of his neck and caused him to fall. Icarus grabbed the knives before examining them, yet he noticed Root from 7 fall to the ground with a knife in his thigh that had just been trolled by Emerald. Emerald winked at Icarus, and he grabbed his sword before plunging it into Root's wound, which caused him to scream. Icarus did not appear to enjoy his screams, and he quickly plunged his sword into Root's heart, which seized his movement. Icarus saw Spectacle beheading the boy from 6, who was struggling to stay above the water due to his rather stocky build. Aurelia and Emerald continued defending their side of the cornucopia from the other tributes with Spectacle, which saw Emerald firing an arrow into Tobe's back and Spectacle killing Caliente the boy from 6 with his machete. Aurelia was preparing an arrow, yet she was suddenly seized from behind by Solara from 5. Solara, who was just as tall as Aurelia, attempted to strangle her, which caused Aurelia to scream for help and reach for her bow and arrow. However, Solara saw this and kicked the bow and arrow away, yet she was spotted by Spectacle, who ran towards her and slammed his machete through her stomach. Stretcher ran towards Syndicate, and as soon as he spotted her, he noticed Tab grabbing a knife and continuing to pursue her. It is unknown why Tab pursued Syndicate when all the other tributes were still in the cornucopia, yet it is suspected Tab thought killing Syndicate would emotionally weaken Stretcher. Stretcher saw him and snarled, before deciding whether to pursue Tab or Syndicate or to grab a weapon. Stretcher eventually decided to grab a weapon, and he darted into the cornucopia to see Icarus stabbing Root in the heart. Stretcher hesitated for a second before grabbing an axe from the wall and narrowly avoiding a sickle that had been thrown by Fonio. Stretcher grabbed the axe, and upon seeing Tab raising his knife, he ran towards him and pushed him away from Syndicate, while shouting at her to run. Syndicate screamed as Tab got to his feet and charged at Stretcher, yet Stretcher shouted at her to run once more whilst grabbing Tab by the neck. Stretcher looked around to see Peppa from 11 fall to her knees with an arrow in her head that had just been fired by Aurelia. Tab was now holding his knife at the ready, whilst Stretcher was blocking his knife with his axe. The boys began fighting for a few moments, and it was not visible to the audience what was happening until Tab staggered backwards with Stretcher's axe in his stomach. Stretcher grabbed his axe and slammed it into Tab's stomach again, which caused him to fall into the water and begin convulsing. Icarus had wiped his hands free of Root's blood and marched into the cornucopia before lying down on the table and yawning. Rubius swore and began shouting at Icarus to get up and behave, so loudly that Priscilla nearly fell out of her seat. Even Aurelia seemed perplexed by what Icarus was doing, and she smacked her head, yet she quickly spun around and called out to him, which caused him to spin around and see the girl from 6 charging at him with a knife. Icarus got to his feet, yet Aurelia fired an arrow at her head and the girl fell to her knees. Aurelia then hurled Emerald doing a cheerful and immature victory dance as one of her knives hit the heart of the girl from 8, which caused her to fall to the ground. Emerald then turned and shrieked as Shad from 4 appeared from behind with his trident. Aurelia spun around as Shad lunged towards her with his trident, and he very nearly plunged it into her throat. However, Aurelia managed to get her hands on one of her arrows, and despite not having the bow, she managed to plunge the arrow into Shad's neck again and again until he stopped moving. The couriers then gathered together as the remaining tributes all fled from the cornucopia and, with some difficulty, made it to the edges of the rocky island in order to try to see other tributes. Yet it looked like all of them had fled. The couriers made it back to the cornucopia, gave each other victory slaps, and they sorted through the weapons. Icarus asked if they should go towards the mountains or towards the forest, yet Emerald seemed adamant to stay in the lake. As Icarus frowned and asked Emerald why she wanted to stay. Yet just then, Fonio, who had been hiding behind a table, ran out in fear with his hands covering a yellow pillow. Icarus swore and threw his sword at Fonio, yet he managed to duck and the sword landed in the water. Icarus grabbed Fonio and asked him what he was doing, and through his tears, he told her he was trying to survive. Emerald laughed and punched Fonio in the mouth, and Fonio, who was one of the youngest tributes in this year's lineup, flinched and begged Emerald not to kill him. Emerald asked him to give her a reason to spare him, while Icarus appeared to pity Fonio and asked him to leave.